Do you really know how compression works? So if you're like me, at some point you were probably told that a compressor limits the dynamic range of your audio by making the loud parts quiet and the quiet parts loud. But is that really the case? Today I want to dive in and show you how some of what you've been told about compression may be misleading, and what you should be paying attention to when applying compression. But before we get started, go ahead and do me a favor and drop a comment with your top 3 favorite compressors. Maybe one you like to use on vocals, one you like to use on drums, and one you like to use on your mix bus. If you want to maybe go ahead and leave some details about, why you like to use that compressor for what purpose, I'd love to learn more about your process. So thanks for the comment, let's dive in. All right, so here we have a standard kick drum loop. I'll go ahead and play that for you. All right, nothing too crazy, nothing too fancy. But let's say, it's a little punchy, that knock is a little too much. We want to kind of tame that transient, right? Apply some compression, because we've all heard a compressor is going to limit our dynamic range, right? Make the loud part quieter. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's throw on, let's say the glue compressor. Now the reason I'm using the glue compressor is because the stock compressor, if we pull that up, has the makeup gain already enabled, right? I don't really want that. I want to show you guys what the compressor is doing. So let's pull up the glue compressor, just the default glue compressor, right? Let's just go ahead and start applying some gain reduction. All right, so now we're doing some heavy compression. We can really hear it clamping down on that volume. So it must be making the loud part quieter, right? But is that the case? Let's go ahead and compensate for that 5 dB gain reduction. And let me freeze this track and flatten it so you can actually take a look at what's going on in the audio. So if we look, we applied compression, right? A compressor makes the loud parts quieter, but this looks more punchy. If anything, after I did the makeup gain, the loud part got louder. But how is that possible? A compressor limits dynamic range, right? It should be making the loud parts quieter, but here it's making the loud part louder. It's almost expanding our dynamic range. What's going on? All right, maybe I did something wrong. Okay, maybe I did something wrong. So, okay, let's label this as 4 ratio. All right, let's go back up to our original kick and let's change this to ratio of 10. All right, so maybe now I'm compressing a little more. Maybe I'll get the results that I'm looking for. Let's freeze that, let's duplicate it, and let's flatten it. So wait, this is ratio 10, and they look almost the same. They're getting punchier. So this is why it's important to know how a compressor works, right? If you want some thicker and fatter drums, you're gonna need to make some changes. Let's start by playing with the attack time. So let me go back to our original kick. All right, let's have a listen. I'm gonna drop that attack time to the fastest it can go. Adjust the threshold so that we get the same -5. All right, now let's freeze this, duplicate it, and flatten. So you can see we're still getting a little bit of that expansion, but it's definitely less drastic than the bottom 2 tracks. But if we listen closely, right, I'll A/B this new compressed version with the original dry kick, you'll start to hear that sustain is just starting to poke its head through, right? It's just starting to come up a little bit. All right, so this is our original kick and the new one. So the change is subtle, but it's audible, right? You can just start to hear that sustain just poke out a little bit more than the uncompressed kick. So if we're getting a little bit of what we wanted, what happens when we really start to push the threshold? Let me go ahead and turn that compressor back on. And let's go to like 7.5 dBs. All right, let's go ahead and freeze that, duplicate it. All right, so now if we take a look here, right, we have the original kick, and you can see that low end is it's there, but it's quieter than the transient. Now that low end is really starting to come out, right? It's almost the same level as that transient. Let's go ahead and A/B. Okay, so now we're starting to get that gushy, that low end, that fat drum sound we were going for when we first applied the compressor. And now, even though we're still getting a little bit of that expansion, it doesn't matter as much. But why? Compressors only limit the dynamic range of your audio during the compression phase. The compression phase only happens after the full extent of the attack time has been fulfilled and before the compressor is completely released. So in that 0.1, 1, 10, 30 millisecond attack time you have set up, no compression's being applied, right? And that's why in the first examples, the transients were allowed to poke through. So if you wanted to bring up the sustain of your kick drum, but you're using a slow attack time, what you're really going to be doing is decreasing the amount of sustain because you're allowing the transient to pass in that 10 millisecond window of time and then chomping down on the sustain section. So more important than your threshold setting or your ratio setting or what style of compressor you're using, more important than any of that is your attack and release times. These settings will ultimately control how the compressor affects your sound. Let's check out how the release time can play a factor. So here we have a basic top loop, nothing crazy, I'll play it for you. Right, nothing crazy. But let's say that open hi-hat is sticking out just a little bit more than we want it to, right? Okay, so we want to limit its dynamic range. And so now we've learned that if we want to really start chomping down on that transient, we have to use a fast attack time. Let's go ahead and do that. So I'll pull up the default glue compressor. Let's do attack really fast so it chomps down on that transient. And just to even everything out, let's say, I don't really know too much about the way a compressor works. I'll use a long sustain time so that way it's really just evening everything out. All right, so we can see it's chomping down -5 whenever that open hi-hat hits. Let's go ahead and compensate again. And let's freeze, duplicate, and flatten. Okay, so we're getting a bit of that expansion, right? But overall, the average level of the hi-hat, the claps, and the snares is starting to even out. Right, so now the hat's more even with the claps and the snares, all that stuff. But do you hear what else is happening? I'm gonna A-B a couple more times so you can get a feel for what's happening. Do you hear it? Let's go ahead and focus in on this last bar where there's more of those smaller hi-hats, the little shakers in between the hi-hats. So do you hear what's happening now? The shakers that are happening after those open hi-hats are also getting compressed by like -3, -4 dB, right? And this is because that release time is very long. So the compressor chomps down on those open hi-hats because they're loud, but because the release time isn't fast enough to get out of the way, those shakers are being brought down in level as well. But we only wanted to affect the open hi-hats, right? So this is just a byproduct of a bad release time setting. So let's see what happens when I drop the release time to maybe somewhere around the middle, somewhere like 0.4, 0.6, and let's see if I can get that excitement back out of those small shakers. Ah, there we go. So now it's starting to even out those open hi-hats, but allowing the shakers to pass through a little bit better. Let's go ahead and freeze and take a look. So I think that this shows it very clearly, right? If we take a look at this little shaker right here, it's thicker in the one where there's a shorter release time than the one with the longer release time. And that's because the compressor digs in on this open hi-hat and doesn't have enough time to get out of the way before the next time it has to dig in. However, here, it digs in, it clamps down on that hat, but then it gets out of the way and allows that shaker to pass through. So hopefully now we're starting to see the importance of setting the proper attack and release times for your compressor. Let's move on to something that's not a drum, right? Drums are very transient forward. Let's check out a bass guitar, for example. So you can hear that this sample is a nice blend between those percussive attacks, but also it has a lot of sustain energy, right? So what compressor settings would we want to use? Let's go ahead and start with a slow attack and a medium release. And again, I'm going to go for -5 gain reduction. All right, let's go ahead and freeze that and have a look. Just like I thought, we're making the percussive elements louder while leaving the tone relatively unchanged. So again, this whole compressors make the loud stuff quieter thing doesn't really hold up, right? Because the transients in the first example, they were the loudest part, but now they're not getting quieter, they're getting louder. So let's see what happens if we switch this to a fast attack time, right? Let's go to the fastest attack time we can. All right. All right, that's an average of 5 dB. Let's go ahead and freeze that. Okay, so now we're starting to see that the tone is matching the transients in level. But let's see what happens if we really squash this bass. Let's just go for it. Let's go -10 on this example. Yeah, right about there. Let's go ahead and freeze that, duplicate, and flatten. All right, let's go ahead and unfreeze this, take that compressor off, and let's A/B between the dry, uncompressed bass and our printed, -10 dB compressed bass. So you can hear that the compressed bass is starting to sound way beefier than the original, right? And now we're starting to get that whole loud becomes quiet, quiet becomes loud thing, right? If we take a look at the original, the transient was loud and the tone was quiet, but in the compressed version, they're about the same. The energy's about the same. Now I have a question for you. We're digging in by 10 dBs. That's a lot of compression. But why doesn't it sound overcompressed? I'll go ahead and A/B one more time. Right? It doesn't sound overcompressed. Why is that? If we take a look at the compressor, we can actually almost see why. It's the release time. Watch the needle as this goes down. The compressor is allowing itself to reset to a reasonable amount of gain reduction between each note. I'm going to go ahead and jack this up to the 1.2 seconds. I'm going to freeze that. Let's duplicate and flatten that. And then I'll make this one go back to the original 0.6 release time. Now let's A/B so you can hear the difference, right? The notes almost get lost with the longer release time. Right, you can almost hear that the transition between notes is muddy, it's lost, it's not clear. It sounds overcompressed. Let's go ahead and jack this release time up to 0.1, and let's see if those notes, those transitions, actually end up coming out. So our theory is correct, right? These notes, these transitions are coming out. In the fast release version, you can almost hear the string being pressed against the wood between each note. So based on this, I can infer that the sound of overcompression oftentimes has nothing to do with the amount of gain reduction that you're doing. I mean, I'm squashing all these examples by 10 dBs. That's a lot of gain reduction. So what I can infer is that overcompression is a result of improper use of attack and release times. This proves my point that I said at the beginning that more important than your threshold or your ratio are your attack and release time settings. Let's move on to a vocal. I feel that vocal compression is something that just eludes every artist, every engineer, every producer. They always have trouble with it. And I think the reason for this is that the human ear is attuned to the human voice. We evolved to hear the human voice more clearly than almost anything else. You know what a human voice should sound like. You speak to your friends and family, you go to school, you listen to a teacher, you listen to music, you listen to podcasts, you know what the human voice should sound like. So the minute we overcompress, we over EQ, we oversaturate, it's more easy to identify something's going on here. So let me go ahead and show you the vocal that I chose for today.
I'ma leave ya down up on them streets, hit you with the heat, hit you with the heat.
Pretty standard rap vocal, pretty well recorded. Now, I chose a rap vocal for the same reason that I chose a bass guitar, right? It has a nice blend of transient energy, but also lots of elements that have sustain and tone that need to be preserved. But I also chose this vocal because you can hear that around this area, he kind of loses energy, right? He's almost like running out of breath. And then he has to take this big breath to get into that last half of the phrase. Let's go ahead and take a listen.
I'ma leave ya down up on them streets, hit you with the heat, hit you with the heat.
You can hear down up on them streets. He has to take that big breath. He's running out of air, right? So everyone always says, I put a compressor on the vocal to kind of even out the dynamics, right? So let's go ahead and try and do that. So I want to level out his dynamics, but I also want to preserve all that transient percussive energy so that his vocal will poke through a mix, right? So my instinct tells me to go with a slower attack, not too slow, but just slow enough so I can let some of that transient energy through, and a fast release time so that the compressor can kind of get out of the way between each of these words.
I'ma leave ya down up on them streets, hit you with the heat, hit you with the heat. I'ma leave ya down up on them streets, hit you with the heat, hit you with the heat.
All right, so I'm going to squash this a bit more than I would, right? And that's so I can level out the difference between these two sections. So let's go ahead and freeze that, duplicate it, and flatten it. All right, so now we can see that the tone, the sustain of all these words is now starting to level out, right? So the louder section in the beginning now got brought to the same volume as that middle section that was where he was kind of lacking, where he kind of needed that breath. So again, let me just go ahead and unfreeze this, bypass an AB.
I'ma leave ya down up on them streets, hit you with the heat, hit you with the heat. I'ma leave ya down up on them streets, hit you with the heat, hit you with the heat. I'ma leave ya down up on them streets, hit you with the heat, hit you with the heat. I'ma leave ya down up on them streets, hit you with the heat, hit you with the heat.
So to me, it's starting to sound like the compressed version is a more upfront style of vocal, right? We're adding some energy to the beginning of the words to allow them to poke through, but we're also making the performance more consistent. Now, some of you may have heard of something called serial compression. Or, I've seen on Instagram posts that just tell you, use two compressors instead of one. It'll even out the dynamics. Or, put one compressor for short and one compressor for long, but they don't really tell you how or why or, what you're doing that for. This is an example where I would use serial compression. And I would use it to tame some of this transient energy that we gained, right? So you can see here that first word of each of these phrases gets a little loud, right? We're actually adding a lot of energy there, right? So I would use serial compression to just tame those transients. Only this time, I'm going to be using a limiter instead of a compressor. So, to do that, I will go 2.5 up and 2.5 down.
I'ma leave ya down up on them streets, hit you with the heat, hit you with the heat. I'ma leave ya down up on them streets, hit you with the heat, hit you with the heat. I'ma leave ya down up on them streets, hit you with the heat, hit you with the heat. I'ma leave ya down up on them streets, hit you with the heat, hit you with the heat.
Right, so you can see the limiter chomping down on those two transient areas, right? Take a close look.
I'ma leave ya down up on them streets, hit you with the heat, hit you with the heat. I'ma leave ya down up on them streets, hit you with the heat, hit you with the heat.
But why would I use a limiter to do this and not a compressor? In fact, what's the difference between a limiter and a compressor? Now, most people will tell you that a limiter is a brick wall with an infinite ratio, right? Something that won't allow anything to pass above the threshold. Well, if that's true, why do we need limiters at all? Can't we just set the ratio on our compressor to infinite and then call it a day? So let's go ahead and test that theory out. I'm going to go ahead and drag a compressor over here. I'm going to turn the makeup gain off. That's the reason I wasn't using it before. And let's jack the ratio up to infinity, fastest attack, and let's match that release time. It was 20 milliseconds. Threshold is negative 2.5, and output was 2.5. And that's because on the limiter, I gained in 2.5, right? So that's the same as reducing and compensating. So if we take a listen to the compressor one,
I'ma leave ya down up on them streets, hit you with the heat, hit you with the heat.
It's almost doing the exact same thing as the limiter was, right? It's only digging in on those transient things. So in theory, we've created a limiter here, right? Well, I'm not convinced. Just to be sure, let's go ahead and drag a utility plugin on the compressor track. And I'm going to go ahead and do something crazy. I'm going to flip the phase on this track. Now, in theory, because we're using the same vocal and we're getting the same amount of gain reduction, these two vocals should cancel each other out, right? Just to prove that, let's go ahead and play them together without flipping the phase. And then I'll flip the phase while it's playing.
I'ma leave ya down up on them streets.
it disappears. So we've almost perfectly matched these settings, right? I haven't muted anything. I've just flipped the phase. It's just phase cancellation. But I'm going to play it one more time and see if you can hear what's consistently sticking out. Do you hear it? It's the attack time. If we take a look at the limiter, we won't find an attack time setting. There's no attack time. There's a look ahead, but there's no attack time. As soon as we hit the threshold, the limiter starts chomping down. There's no knee, there's no ratio, nothing. If it goes above the threshold, we take it down. And this is the reason why I chose to use a limiter after my compressor and not another compressor, right? Because with a compressor, you have an attack time. No matter what, you're going to be adding some amount of transient energy to your audio. I don't want that. Again, if this is what the compressor is doing to my audio and I want to tame these peaks over here, I don't want a 0.1 millisecond attack time. As soon as you see that spike, just do me a favor, bring the level down. Now, there are some limiters out there that may look like they have an attack time. FabFilter Pro L2 is a great example of this. Let's pull up the default, and we'll see plain as day attack time. But if we leave our mouse there for a second and we read what pops up, we'll actually learn that this attack knob is an attack knob for the release time. So just to prove my point, I'm going to go ahead and jack this attack time all the way up to 10 seconds. In theory, we wouldn't get any limiting, right? Because it would take 10 seconds for that limiter to fully attack.
I'ma leave you down up on them streets.
Only that's not the case. Hopefully these examples have shed some light on some of the misconceptions we all have about compression. When used correctly, compression can be used as a powerful tool to control your mix. When used incorrectly, however, you may be in danger of doing the exact opposite of what you intend to your music. So I encourage you to spend some time doing what I just did, right? Pull up some of your favorite compressors and play around with their settings. Figure out the ins and outs of what that compressor can do for you. The more you understand about the tools in your belt, the quicker and more efficient you can actually achieve the results you're looking for. So thank you all for watching. Hope you guys learned something. Hope you guys enjoyed, and I hope to see you all next time.